Imagine walking down this dense, really crooked city street, right?
Yep.
And the residential homes, they literally have no doors.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. And I mean, we are not talking about some avant-garde, open concept architectural design choice here.
Right, right.
We are talking about a neighborhood where the people living inside are so profoundly destitute, so stripped of anything of material value, that they have absolutely nothing left to steal.
That is just bleak.
It really is. There is just no point in having a door because there is nothing behind it worth protecting. The wood from the door itself was, probably burned for warmth weeks ago.
Right.
Welcome to London in the 1840s.
It is a staggering image, isn't it? To really try and put yourself in the shoes of someone surviving in a space that has been stripped down to that level of bare, exposed existence.
It completely upends how we usually think about the concept of shelter. Usually when we look at the building's blueprints or even just think about the history of housing, there's this underlying assumption of, logic and safety.
Exactly.
A roof keeps the rain out, walls keep the cold out, a door keeps the danger out. We like to think of housing as this fundamental human necessity that we had basically figured out by the 19th century.
You think so, yeah.
But then you crack open the historical sources we have stacked up for today's deep dive, and suddenly those blueprints look completely different. We're no longer looking at designs for human shelter. We are looking at designs for economic extraction.
Which is a heavy pivot. It changes the entire framework of urban history.
Right.
You are no longer looking at cities as places where people live, but as massive engines where people are consumed.
And that is exactly what we're going to unpack today. We are taking a massive, comprehensive deep dive into the historical origins of the urban housing crisis.
It's going to be intense.
Definitely. To do that, we are looking specifically through the lens of Friedrich Engels' writings, pulling heavily from the Marx and Engels collected works.
The MECW.
Yes, exactly. We are focusing on two foundational texts. His incredibly visceral early work, The Condition of the Working Class in England, published in 1845, and his later razor-sharp 1872 essay, The Housing Question.
Both are just incredible documents.
They really are. Our mission today is to explore how the rapid, blinding pace of 19th century industrialization basically invented the modern urban slum. And we want to examine Engels' fierce critiques of the various solutions proposed by the wealthy bourgeoisie and the utopian reformers of his time.
And just a quick heads up to you, the listener, before we really get into the weeds here.
It's all.
We are going to be pulling from some heavily debated foundational texts dealing with capitalism, socialism, and intense class struggle.
Very politically charged stuff.
Extremely. But we aren't here today to take a political side, to endorse these views, or to tell you what to believe about modern economics. Our job is strictly to act as your historical guides.
Right.
To unpack, impartially report on, and deeply analyze exactly what Engels was arguing 150 years ago, based solely on the source material in front of us.
Spot on. We are here to understand the mechanics of his arguments, not to run a political campaign. And honestly, what hooked me immediately when I was reading through these texts is how shockingly, almost uncomfortably modern an essay from 1872 sounds today.
It's eerie, isn't it?
It is. You read Engels writing about skyrocketing urban rents, mass gentrification, working class people being aggressively pushed out of city centers to make way for commercial real estate, and severe housing shortages.
All there.
If you just redacted the dates and the names of the cities, if you crossed out London or Manchester and wrote in San Francisco or London today, it reads like a fiercely written op-ed published yesterday morning.
It really does.
It's uncanny how the language mirrors our current anxieties.
It is entirely uncanny. But to understand why it sounds so modern, we have to meticulously set the historical stage. We need to look at the mid-19th century, a period of unprecedented violent economic transformation.
The industrial boom.
Exactly. The steam engine and the introduction of large-scale factory machinery didn't just change how things were made, they changed where humans existed.
Right, the migration to the cities.
You had this sudden, overwhelming rush of populations being uprooted from agrarian countryside lives and pouring into the cities. Towns were transforming into massive, smog-choked industrial centers virtually overnight.
And this created an absolute, unmitigated crisis of physical living space.
It really did.
I want to get right into the tactile reality of that living space, because the descriptions Engels provides are horrific. It challenges our basic modern understanding of human survival.
It definitely does.
The Industrial Revolution didn't just need giant iron machines. It required massive agglomerations of human bodies packed as tightly as possible around those machines.
And Engels wasn't just theorizing about these conditions from a comfortable mahogany desk in a library. He was out there.
He was walking the streets.
He was walking through these neighborhoods, conducting early sociological fieldwork. He documents how the sudden influx of people meant that every conceivable square inch of urban space was monetized and occupied.
Landlords were just cramming people in.
Completely, regardless of whether those spaces were fit for human habitation.
I was looking at his specific notes on a London neighborhood called St. Giles, which he refers to as a rookery.
A very telling word choice.
Right. For anyone who doesn't know, a rookery is a dense, noisy colony of breeding birds, which gives you an idea of the sheer crowding he's describing. He talks about tall, crumbling, 3- or 4-story houses that are basically leaning on each other for structural support.
Just structurally failing buildings.
Yeah, and the streets are impossibly narrow, crooked, and filthy. Imagine a vegetable market right in the middle of this street, but there's no refrigeration, no sanitation, so the leftover food is just rotting into the mud.
Just a horrific stench.
Exactly, creating a stench that mixes with the smell of open fish stalls.
He specifically notes the verticality of the misery, too. The houses are occupied from the flooded, windowless cellars all the way up to the sweltering garrets in the attic.
The filth is just absolute.
It defies 19th century vocabulary, honestly.
And this brings me back to the hook I started with, the detail about the doors. He describes wandering down these covered, shadowy passages that lead into narrow courts and alleys.
Right.
The brick walls are crumbling, the window frames are completely shattered, and in this one specific area he calls the thieves' quarter, the houses have no doors.
Because they had nothing left to steal.
Because, again, the residents had nothing left to steal. You have heaps of garbage, ashes, and literal foul liquids, raw human waste emptied right out the front of these doorless entryways.
Gathering in stinking, stagnant pools.
Yes, that people have to wade through just to go to work.
It is a complete and total breakdown of basic civilizational sanitation. And it is crucial to note that this wasn't an isolated London phenomenon.
Oh, really? Where else?
When Engels examines Glasgow, he pulls from a police superintendent's report that describes the slums there as Augean stables.
Augean stables.
Yeah.
That's referencing the myth of the stables that hadn't been cleaned in 30 years, right?
Exactly. The city inspectors went into these residential cellars at night and found rooms where 15 to 20 men and women were huddled together on the bare, damp floor.
I read that part. Their bed was just a singular heap of musty straw mixed with whatever rags they could find.
No furniture.
Not a single chair or table. Just 20 people in a damp hole in the ground. And the kicker is that Engels points out these conditions were so structurally compromised, so dangerous, that the city's Court of Guild legally condemned them as uninhabitable.
Which legally meant the landlords were barred from charging rent for those specific spaces.
But the cellars were still filled to overflowing.
Of course they were.
The landlords just collected the money illicitly because the people pouring into Glasgow simply had nowhere else to go. It was either the illegal, collapsing cellar, or freezing in the street.
It was a captive market.
Which actually leads to something I need to challenge, or at least get some clarity on. When we look at this sheer blinding speed of industrialization, with thousands of people arriving every week, wasn't the population explosion the real culprit here?
That is the pivotal question of Engels' entire economic analysis.
Was this entirely a malicious, calculated move by capitalists to oppress people? Or was it just a logistical nightmare where they literally couldn't build houses fast enough?
It's very tempting to view this as a tragic logistical failure. But Engels argues forcefully that the slum wasn't a glitch in the system.
It wasn't.
No, it wasn't a temporary growing pain of rapid population growth that would eventually sort itself out. It was a required feature of the capitalist system.
Okay, I need to wrap my head around that. You're saying the slums weren't a failure of city planning, but an active, necessary requirement for the economy to function.
Yes.
That sounds dangerously close to a conspiracy theory. How does that actually work mechanically?
It comes down to the mechanics of wage suppression. To keep profits high, capitalists need to keep wages as low as mathematically possible.
Okay, that makes sense.
To keep wages low, the capitalist system requires what Marx and Engels termed a reserve army of unemployed workers.
Meaning an intentional surplus of desperate people. You need more workers than there are jobs.
Precisely. Let's imagine a factory door. If you only have exactly enough workers to fill the machines, those workers have leverage.
Right. If they demand an extra penny an hour, the factory owner has to pay it or the machine stops.
Exactly. But if you have a massive reserve army of poor, starving people standing outside the factory door, desperate for any work at all, the workers inside have zero leverage.
Wow.
The factory owner can say, if you don't accept the starvation wage, there are 50 guys outside who will gladly take your spot.
Ah, I see. So the desperation of the point.
Yes. And if you rely on a massive reserve army of perpetually impoverished, desperate people to keep your labor costs down, you inevitably generate a massive demand for the absolute cheapest, most degraded housing possible.
They need somewhere to sleep.
The capitalists who owned urban real estate didn't see a crisis. They saw a highly captive market. They saw an opportunity to monetize misery.
Unbelievable.
Engels argues that as long as a capitalist mode of production exists, this cyclical housing shortage and the resulting slums are absolutely necessary to maintain the power dynamic between labor and capital.
That makes the Durham coal miners example from the text makes so much more sense. Because at first it just reads like mustache-twirling villainy,
Right.
but in this context, it's a structural mechanism.
It perfectly illustrates the point.
Walk us through what happened in Durham in 1863, because this shows how housing was actively weaponized.
So in Durham, you have a situation where the capitalists, the mine owners, are also the landlords. The miners decide to go on strike for better conditions.
Okay.
The owners don't just lock them out of the mine, they evict them from their homes. And this happens in the severest, most brutal winter weather.
Wait, they literally throw the workers, their wives, their young children, and whatever meager furniture they have right out into the freezing street.
The workers try to survive sleeping in the open air. Some of them are so desperate they break back into their own evacuated, freezing dwellings just to survive the night on the bare floorboards.
Just to not freeze to death.
So the next day, what do the mine owners do? They send men to nail the doors and windows shut and bar them entirely.
Leaving the miners with no choice but to go out into the surrounding fields and build these makeshift wooden cabins and turf wigwams out of mud and grass just to keep their families from freezing in the snow.
And here is the brutal climax of that event. The mine owners then order those turf wigwams torn down and destroyed too because they were technically built on the owners' fields.
That is just vicious.
Engels highlights this to prove that housing wasn't just an accidental byproduct of poverty, it was a tool of violent enforcement. By controlling the housing, the capitalist controls the workers' very ability to exist.
But wait, if the working class neighborhoods were essentially open sewers of cholera and people are freezing in the streets, how did the wealthy factory owner survive?
That's a great question.
I mean, a cholera outbreak doesn't check your bank account balance before it infects you. Did the wealthy just build massive physical walls around their mansions to keep the plague out?
They didn't build literal walls of stone, but they built geographical walls of urban planning.
Yeah.
How do you live in a city built entirely on human misery without ever having to look at it?
You design the city to hide it.
You design the city to hide it.
And this brings us to the physical layout of these industrial boom towns. The sources go into incredible detail about Manchester, which was the beating heart, the epicenter of English manufacturing at the time.
It's a fascinating layout.
Engels maps out the physical layout of the city, and it reads like a masterpiece of deliberate, calculated urban segregation.
He describes it wonderfully. At the very heart of Manchester, you have a commercial district. It's about half a mile long and equally broad, filled entirely with offices, warehouses, and commercial spaces.
Okay, so a pure business district.
Right. It is a hub of frantic activity during the day, but it is almost completely deserted at night, save for the police on patrol.
Makes sense.
And immediately surrounding this commercial core is what Engels calls a girdle of unmixed working-class quarters.
A girdle?
Yes. This dense ring of slums, rookeries, and factories stretches out for a mile and a half in every direction. It's where the smoke is thickest and the crowding is worst.
And then crucially, outside of that polluted working-class girdle, you have the upper and middle bourgeoisie. They live in breezy, wholesome suburbs, in fine, comfortable homes with gardens and clean air.
Exactly.
But here's the part that just fascinated me. How do the wealthy get from their clean, breezy suburbs into that central commercial district every day without having to wade through a mile and a half of rotting vegetables, doorless houses, and open sewage?
The commute. It's all about the commute.
Right.
Engels observes how the omnibuses carry the wealthy industrialists along these main arterial thoroughfares that cut directly through the working-class girdle. but these roads are deliberately lined on both sides with an unbroken, continuous series of elegant shops.
It's a literal facade. It's like a movie set.
Exactly. The shop owners, out of pure self-interest to attract wealthy clientele, keep the storefronts looking immaculate, clean, and respectable.
So the wealthy factory owner can leave his suburban villa, get on his omnibus, ride into the city center every single morning, and ride back every single evening without ever once seeing the grimy, devastating misery that is lurking just 50 feet behind those shop storefronts.
Never even catches a glimpse.
The architecture of the city itself is complicit in maintaining their psychological ignorance. They don't have to feel guilty because they literally cannot see it.
It is out of sight, out of mind, built right into the blueprints of the city. And this brings up a massive urban planning concept that Engels critiques heavily in the housing question.
The Haussmann method, right?
Yes, he refers to a specific method of dealing with the urban poor, which he terms Haussmann.
I was looking at the notes on this. This is named after Georges Eugene Haussmann, the famous Parisian city planner who worked under Napoleon III.
The very same.
I've always heard Haussmann praised for making Paris the beautiful city of light with those massive, gorgeous avenues. But what exactly was the Haussmann method when it came to the housing crisis?
The Haussmann method, as Engels deconstructs it, was absolutely not about solving the housing shortage for the poor workers. It was entirely about protecting the bourgeoisie.
How so?
In Paris, Haussmann drove wide, straight, incredibly long boulevards right through the heart of the most densely packed, historically working-class district.
And the official line, ostensibly, was that this was for beautification, right?
Yeah.
And to improve public health by letting air and light into the slums.
That was the public relations angle, yes. But the primary driver was strategic military necessity.
Wait, urban planning is military strategy.
Absolutely. You have to remember the history of Paris, the revolutions of 1789, 1830, 1848. The Parisian working class was famous for urban guerrilla warfare.
Oh, wow, of course. The barricades.
Right. In narrow, crooked, winding streets, it is very easy for a few dozen workers to chop down some trees, overturn some carts, and build an impenetrable barricade.
Oh, I see. A maze of narrow streets is a nightmare for an organized army to navigate.
Right. But wide, perfectly straight, macadamized boulevards. Those make it impossible to build a barricade. More importantly, they make it incredibly easy for the government to march massive columns of troops straight into the neighborhood and fire artillery cannons directly down the street.
That is deeply chilling. So urban planning was basically counterinsurgency. You build a beautiful avenue so you can shoot cannons down it if the poor ask for too much bread.
Precisely. And Engels points out that this practice didn't stay in Paris, it became general across Europe.
It was exported.
Whether a city claimed they needed to build a new railway station or a new commercial district or a wide avenue for carriage traffic, the operational method was always the same. Find the most scandalous, overcrowded alleys and slums and demolish them.
Let's wipe them out.
And then the bourgeoisie pats itself on the back in the newspapers, declaring a tremendous success in urban renewal and public health.
But hold on. Demolishing a slum doesn't demolish the human beings who lived in it. They didn't just evaporate into the smog. Where did they go?
That is the absolute crux of Engels' critique. He says the bourgeoisie never actually abolishes the slums. They do not solve the housing question. They merely shift it elsewhere.
They just move the problem.
The exact same economic necessity that produced the slum in the first place, that need for a desperate reserve army of labor, just recreates the slum in the next neighborhood over.
It's like squeezing a water balloon.
Yes, exactly.
The bourgeoisie squeezes the slum out of the city center with a new railway station. But the water inside the balloon doesn't disappear. It just bulges out on the fringes of the city where the pressure is lower, creating a new, equally packed slum.
That's a perfect way to visualize it.
If we pull this forward to today, it sounds exactly like the mechanics of modern gentrification. You demolish a low-income housing project, you build a luxury high-rise or a trendy commercial center, and the original residents are just pushed further to the geographical margins of the city.
Often into worse, more crowded conditions because the overall housing supply just shrank.
The map changes, but the fundamental economic reality of poverty doesn't budge an inch.
That is exactly the dynamic Engels is identifying. He gives a very specific, undeniable example of this in Manchester.
Little Ireland, right?
Yes. There was a notorious, heavily Irish slum called Little Ireland. It was located in the valley of the Medlock River, highly prone to flooding, and generally considered one of the worst spots in the city. Eventually, the city tore it down to make way for a massive new railway station.
And I'm guessing the local politicians celebrated this as a great triumph of progress and civilization.
Endlessly. But Engels points out that years later, a severe flood occurred in a different part of the city. The floodwaters receded, and what did they reveal? Little Ireland hadn't been abolished at all.
They just moved.
The exact same people, living in the exact same horrific, overcrowded conditions, had just reestablished themselves a mile away on the north side of the road. The problem was just moved down the street.
Okay, but I have to circle back to my self-preservation question. Because eventually, squeezing the water balloon isn't enough. The wealthy did eventually have to clean up the slums to some degree, didn't they?
They did, yes.
Because sickness doesn't respect zoning laws forever. Didn't they have to stop the diseases from spreading from the working-class girdle into their own breezy garden suburbs?
They absolutely did. As Engels brutally notes, epidemics of cholera, typhus, typhoid fever, and smallpox proved to the British bourgeois that they couldn't just hide behind a facade of elegant shops forever.
The germs found their way in.
The pestilential air, the poisoned groundwater from the slums eventually wafted and seeped into the wealthy villas. The angel of death, as Engels poetically puts it, began raging in the ranks of the capitalists just as ruthlessly as it did in the ranks of the workers.
Ah, so pure self-preservation finally kicks in.
Exactly. The fear of dying from cholera forced the state and the wealthy to start implementing rudimentary sanitation, drainage, and building codes. And this brings us perfectly to the first major set of proposed intellectual reforms that Engels sets out to critique in his 1872 essay, The Philanthropic Bourgeois Solutions.
Let's dive into that, because Engels spends a massive portion of the housing question aggressively dismantling the arguments of bourgeois social reformers. He uses a writer named Dr. Emil Sachs as his primary avatar for this entire school of thought.
Yes, Dr. Sachs.
Dr. Sachs had written a whole book trying to summarize the enlightened bourgeois perspective on how to ethically solve the housing crisis.
And Dr. Sachs's grand theory essentially boils down to diagnosing the root cause of the housing crisis as, well, ignorance.
Ignorance.
Just a simple lack of understanding on all sides.
Ignorance. That is so incredibly condescending. How exactly does he frame this ignorance?
Sachs argues that, on one hand, capitalists simply don't realize that building good, clean housing for workers could actually be a safe and profitable long-term investment.
Oh, they just don't know any better.
Right. If they just knew better, their natural rationality would lead them to build nice homes. And on the flip side, he blames the workers for their own misery.
Of course he does.
He argues that workers squander their hard-earned rent money on drink and all sorts of idle pleasures instead of pulling themselves together and demanding better housing.
Which is such a classic, enduring, moralizing argument, right?
Classic.
You live in a windowless, sewage-filled cellar. Not because your wages are at a starvation level, but because you bought a pint of ale at the pub on Friday. It's poverty as a moral failing. Engels must have had an absolute field day tearing that apart.
He was merciless. Engels points out the utter absurdity of thinking capitalists are just shy of speculating on real estate because they don't know any better.
Right.
He says, to paraphrase, capital naturally never speculates. He highlights that capitalists know exactly what they're doing.
It's all calculated.
The housing shortage isn't an accident of ignorance. It is a necessary, highly profitable institution in a society where workers are completely dependent on wages and subject to massive cyclical industrial fluctuations. Landlords make fortunes precisely because they don't have to spend money on upkeep for a captive market.
So what was Dr. Sachs's actual practical solution? Because surely his entire book wasn't just telling capitalists to read more and telling workers to stop drinking. What was the policy proposal?
Sachs heavily advocated for something called the cottage system.
The cottage system.
Yes. This was a model primarily implemented by rural factory owners. The capitalists would build and own small individual houses with little gardens, specifically for their own workers to live in.
Company towns, basically.
Exactly. Sachs framed this as a beautiful, philanthropic, latent association between capital and labor. It was pitched as benevolent corporate paternalism.
But Engels saw right through the paternalism, and this connects right back to the Durham miners we talked about earlier.
It connects perfectly.
If you live in a house owned by the guy who signs your paycheck, that so-called philanthropy effectively chains you to the factory floor.
Right.
If you try to negotiate for better wages, or if you complain about a dangerous machine, or heaven forbid you go on strike, you don't just lose your weekly paycheck. You and your children are made homeless instantly.
Exactly. Engels argues that this cottage system renders worker resistance nearly impossible. It gives the employer total dictatorial control over the worker's entire existence.
It's terrifying.
And the most damning part is that Sachs actually admits this in his own book.
Wait, he admits it.
He does. Sachs writes that employers must always be in a position to dispose of the dwelling so they have room for a replacement worker if they need to fire someone. He explicitly states that the worker's housing must be revocable.
Wow, so much for beautiful latent associations. It's just a velvet handcuff. But Dr. Sachs had an even bigger, more ambitious utopian dream than just company towns, didn't he?
He did.
He thought the ultimate, final solution to the miseries of capitalism was turning every single worker into a capitalist themselves by giving them ownership of their own little house.
Yes, Sachs waxes incredibly poetic about this. He claims that owning a small home with a mortgage would elevate the worker physically and spiritually. It would restore their domestic peace, give them a stake in society, and turn them into a propertied, respectable citizen.
Okay, here is where the text gets really interesting, because Engels absolutely mocks this idea, but he doesn't just do it with insults. He does it using rigorous foundational economic definitions. I want to make sure we explain this clearly.
We should. It's central to his argument.
How does Engels define capital in this context, and why does he argue so forcefully that a worker owning a home isn't actually becoming a capitalist?
This is a vital, non-negotiable point in Marxist economic theory. You have to understand how they define capital. Capital is not just stuff you own.
Okay.
Capital is defined as command over the unpaid labor of others. It is money or property that is used specifically to extract surplus value from someone else's work.
Okay, so a pile of gold sitting in a vault isn't capital, it's just gold. It only becomes capital when you use it to hire someone to dig more gold for you, and you keep the profit of their labor.
Precisely. Now, apply that to a house. Engels explains that a worker living in their own house is not extracting surplus value from anyone. The house is an item of consumption, not a means of production. It's shelter.
He uses an analogy about a coat, right?
Yes, it's a great clarifying analogy. He says a house you live in ceases to be capital the exact moment you move into it, just as a coat ceases to be capital the moment you buy it from the tailor and put it on your back.
Ah, that makes sense.
The tailor was using the coat as a commodity to make a profit, but once you wear it, you aren't generating profit from it, you're just keeping warm. A worker in a house isn't exploiting anyone, they are just housed.
So, to summarize the bourgeois solution, they want to give workers homes with mortgages to make them conservative, compliant, and tied to the geographic location of the factory, but they don't want to actually give up any real economic leverage or power. It's the illusion of wealth without the actual mechanism of wealth.
You nailed it. It's a pacification strategy. And that precise realization leads Engels to pivot his attack away from the wealthy bourgeoisie and toward another faction entirely, the utopian socialists of the era. Specifically the followers of Pierre-Joseph Proudhon.
This is a fascinating pivot. Enter the Proudhonists, represented in Engels' text by Dr. Arthur Milberger.
Milberger, yes.
Now, the Proudhonists had a radically different take than the bourgeois philanthropists like Dr. Sachs. They didn't think the housing crisis was just a sad side effect of ignorance. They thought the housing crisis was the primary evil of modern society.
That's right. The Proudhonists looked at the economy and decided that the relationship between a tenant and a landlord was identical to the relationship between a wage worker and a factory capitalist.
They saw it as the same exact thing.
They believed that the landlord was exploiting the tenant in the exact same fundamental way a factory owner exploits a factory worker.
And their grand solution to this perceived exploitation was a concept they call eternal justice. And their practical policy for eternal justice was a law where all rent payments would be legally, retroactively converted into installment payments to buy the apartment.
Rent to own by decree.
So instead of paying rent into a landlord's black hole forever, every single rent check acts as a fractional mortgage payment. And eventually, by decree of the state, society becomes a totality of free, independent, debt-free homeowners.
That was the dream.
Now, I have to admit, on paper, to a modern ear struggling to pay rent, A universal rent-to-own scheme sounds kind of nice. It sounds like a great deal.
It sounds incredibly appealing on the surface. It sounds like common sense reform. But this is where we have to step in and meticulously break down how Engels dismantles this idea. Because Engels argues it reveals a profound, almost dangerous misunderstanding of basic economics.
Oh, so.
Engels argues that a rent agreement is just a standard commodity transaction. It is a transfer of already existing value.
Well, let me make sure I'm tracking this. You mean because the house is already built?
Exactly. The labor required to build the house happened in the past. When you pay rent, you are simply buying the temporary use of a commodity, much like renting a horse or a carriage.
Right, you're just paying for the utility of it.
It is not where surplus value is created. According to Marxist economic theory, surplus value, the engine of capitalism, is created in the factory at the point of production, where the worker's labor power is actively exploited to produce more value than they are paid in wages.
Okay, so the landlord might be wildly overcharging you. They might be a slumlord. They might be cheating you on repairs. But they aren't extracting surplus labor from you in the act of renting you a room. You aren't building widgets for the landlord.
Precisely. And therefore, Engels argues the entire Proudhonist focus on housing is a massive petty bourgeois distraction.
Okay, I hear petty bourgeois thrown around a lot as an insult on the internet today, but what did it actually mean to Engels in 1872?
Great question. Petty bourgeois literally means the little city dweller or small business owner. It refers to a class of people who are not the massive industrial capitalists, but they aren't the wage labor proletariat either.
Like the middle class.
Kind of. Think of small shopkeepers, independent artisans, small landlords, or peasants who own a tiny plot of land. They own a little bit of property, and their political worldview is defined by desperately wanting to protect that small property while aspiring to become big capitalists.
Yeah.
All while terrified of falling into the ranks of the poor wage laborers.
Got it. So when Engels calls the Proudhonist plan petty bourgeois, he means it's a philosophy obsessed with making everyone a tiny, independent property owner, rather than addressing the massive industrial scale of modern capitalism.
Exactly. It's a distraction from the real issue, which is the capitalist mode of production itself.
Oh.
And Engels really goes after the logistical and economic illiteracy of this Proudhonist plan. If you simply declare by legal decree that rent is now a mortgage, you are ignoring so many basic economic realities of maintaining buildings and land.
All right, I was reading this section, and Engels brings up ground rent. And I have to admit, I got a little lost in the 19th century terminology there. Could you ELI 5 ground rent for us? Why does Engels say the Proudhonists completely ignore it?
Think of it this way. If you own a patch of dirt in the middle of London and you build a house on it, the value of that property comes from two things: the physical house and the dirt it sits on.
Okay.
Now, let's say the city builds a massive new train station across the street and 5 new factories open up nearby. Your dirt, the land itself, just became incredibly valuable, completely independently of the house.
Ah, I see where this is going.
You didn't do any work, you didn't improve the house, but the land value skyrocketed because of society's collective development around it. That added value is ground rent.
Oh, I see. So if the Proudhonist law says my rent check is just paying off the physical cost of the bricks and mortar of the building, it completely ignores the massive fluctuating value of the land underneath it.
Exactly. Furthermore, Engels points out that the Proudhonist completely forgets that rent must also cover the interest on the original building capital, the cost of ongoing repairs, the buffer for bad debts when tenants can't pay, periods when the house sits empty, and the gradual, inevitable physical depreciation of the building itself over decades.
That's a lot of hidden costs.
You can't just wish those complex financial costs away with a magical decree of eternal justice. You are trying to force a simplistic legal title to override complex market economics without actually changing the underlying capitalist system that drives those economics.
And then, after dismantling the math, Engels drops this hypothetical scenario that just made me laugh out loud because it exposes the sheer bureaucratic absurdity of the plan in practice. He talks about a hypothetical worker named Peter.
The Peter hypothetical is brilliant. It grounds the high theory in ridiculous reality.
Right. So put yourself in the shoes of Peter for a second. Peter is a modern industrial worker, which means he doesn't work in a medieval village. He has to move constantly across the country to follow where the factory jobs are.
A very common situation.
So Peter starts in Berlin. He pays rent, which under this new Proudhonist law is now legally an installment payment on the property. After a year, Peter owns, say, 1/15 of an apartment in Berlin.
Okay, doing great so far.
But then Peter loses his job. The factory closes. He has to move to Hanover to find work. He stays there for 5 months, pays rent, and now he owns 1/36 of an apartment in Hanover.
Oh.
Then a massive strike forces him to move to Munich, where he stays long enough to acquire 11/180ths of a ground floor flat. Over 20 years, Peter ends up owning completely random microscopic fractions of apartments scattered across the entire continent of Europe. 7/360ths in St. Gall, 23/180ths in Leeds, 2/19ths in Paris.
It is a logistical nightmare of epic proportions.
I mean, how on earth does that help Peter? He is lugging around this portfolio of utterly useless fractional real estate. Who was going to buy 7/360ths of a flat in St. Gall from him at full value?
Nobody. Absolutely nobody.
And from the other side, how do you manage a single apartment building that now technically have 300 transient, highly mobile part owners scattered across the globe? It would require an army of accountants just to fix a leaky roof.
It's a total administrative collapse. But Engels uses this hilarious scenario to prove a much deeper, broader philosophical point. The Proudhonist plan is deeply reactionary.
Reactionary meaning looking backward instead of forward.
Yes. It is trying to forcibly turn back the clock to a romanticized time of individual, stable handicraft property. It ignores the reality of modern large-scale industry.
The world had moved on.
The steam engine and the factory system require a highly mobile, fluid workforce that can move to where production is happening. You cannot force 19th century industrial workers back into the medieval guild lifestyle of living and dying in the exact same village cottage. Attempting to do so is just nostalgic fantasy masquerading as radical economics.
Which transitions us perfectly into what I think is the most mind-bending, counterintuitive argument in this entire deep dive. If bourgeois philanthropy is a velvet trap, and Proudhonist rent-to-own schemes are a logistical joke, what happens if workers actually do manage to own their own homes outright?
This is where it gets really deep.
Like, what if a worker pays off their mortgage entirely? Why did Engels believe that giving workers their own homes might actually harm their economic standing in a capitalist system?
This is where Engels brings the hammer down, and he applies a concept known as the iron law of wages. To understand this, we have to look closely at how wages were determined in 19th century classical political economy.
Okay, let's break down the math of this iron law.
Broadly speaking, classical economists viewed human labor as a commodity, just like coal or cotton. And like any commodity, its price, the wage, trends toward the cost of producing it.
Cost of producing a worker.
So, what is the cost of producing a worker? It is the cost of reproducing their labor power. That means wages naturally tend to settle at the exact bare minimum amount of money a worker needs to buy the food, the clothing, and the shelter necessary to survive the night and physically show up to work the next day.
Okay, I'm following. The wage is just the fuel cost to keep the human machine running. No more, no less.
Right. Now, imagine a scenario where a massive portion of the working class suddenly owns their homes outright. No mortgages, no rent. The overall cost of their daily survival drops significantly because they don't have a housing expense.
So they have more disposable income. They can finally buy better food or save money or buy a book. They win, right?
Not under capitalism, Engels argues. Because remember the reserve army of unemployed labor standing outside the factory door? The capitalists will immediately see that the workers now need less money to survive.
Oh.
The factory owner says, why am I paying you 5 shillings a day when you own your home and only need 3 shillings to eat? Because there are desperate people outside willing to work for 3 shillings, the capitalists will simply lower wages across the board. The wage drops by the exact amount the worker is saving on rent.
Oh, wow. That is bleak. It's like getting a highly prestigious academic scholarship, and then the university immediately raises your tuition by the exact dollar amount of the scholarship.
That is a brilliant analogy.
You feel like you won, but the institution just absorbed the surplus. You are right back where you started financially, but now you have the added burden and stress of maintaining the house.
You captured the exact mechanism. You are no better off financially, your labor is still being exploited, but you are now geographically anchored to a specific location, which makes it even harder to strike or move to find a better wage. And Engels provides a massive, real-world, macroeconomic example of this from Germany to prove it isn't just theory.
He looks at the rural domestic industries, right?
Yes. He examines the cottage industries in Germany, like hand-weaving, toy-making, and cigar-making. In Germany, unlike in England at the time, there were many rural wage laborers who owned small cottages and maybe a little garden or a potato patch.
So they had a tiny bit of property.
Exactly. Because they had this property, because they could grow their own potatoes and didn't pay rent, they could technically survive on incredibly low starvation-level wages from their industrial work.
Because they were essentially subsidizing their own factory wages with the calories from their own gardens.
Precisely. And the capitalists exploited this ruthlessly. They depressed wages far below the normal European level. The capitalists basically said, I don't need to pay you enough to buy food because you grow your own potatoes.
So the garden actually hurt them.
The workers' own property became the exact tool used for their extreme exploitation. Engels writes a devastating line about this. He says that this combination of agriculture and industry, the ownership of a house and a garden, became the most terrible shackle to the worker, but the greatest misfortune for the whole working class, the basis for an unprecedented depression of wages below their normal level.
That is just, it's a devastating structural analysis. You think you were building generational security with a little garden, but the system just mathematically recalibrates to extract that newly found security right back out of your paycheck.
It adapts perfectly.
It forces us to ask a really heavy question. If neither bourgeois philanthropy, nor prude honest rent-to-own decrees, nor even mass home ownership solves the problem, what in the world is Engels' actual solution? Did he have one?
He did. After dismantling everyone else's ideas for 50 pages, Engels finally lays out his own twofold solution. And he starts with a very immediate, highly pragmatic, and highly aggressive step.
Which is expropriate.
Yes. He points out a very simple, undeniable physical fact. There are already enough houses, mansions, and empty investment properties in the big cities to remedy the immediate housing shortage if they are just used rationally.
So we don't have to build our way out of the crisis right away.
We don't necessarily need to wait for a massive, decades-long building program to solve the immediate human suffering of people sleeping in cellars.
So his immediate fix is to take the luxury dwellings belonging to the wealthy property classes and institute the compulsory billeting or quartering of homeless or severely overcrowded workers directly into them.
It's a drastic, revolutionary measure. But Engels argues that once the proletariat wins political power, a measure prompted by concern for the public health and the common good is just as easy to legally carry out as the expropriations the bourgeois state already does every single day for things like building railways or widening streets for military boulevards.
It's fascinating because if you think about it, this immediate solution of billeting is essentially what the modern state already does during wartime or extreme natural crises.
Yes, exactly like that.
If a Category 5 hurricane wipes out a coastal town, the government might use emergency powers to requisition local hotels or school gymnasiums for disaster relief to house the displaced. The capacity for this action, the legal framework for eminent domain or emergency requisition, already exists within the DNA of the state apparatus.
It's just waiting to be used.
Engels is just pointing out that under capitalism, the political will to use those emergency powers to solve chronic, everyday poverty is entirely absent. We view a hurricane as an emergency, but we view a slum as just a normal Tuesday.
That is an excellent observation. The tools exist, but the class interests dictate how they are used. However, this raises an incredibly important question.
What's that?
Engels is very careful, almost pedantic, to state that expropriation and billeting is only a temporary stopgap measure.
Right. It's a tourniquet. It addresses the immediate bleeding, but it doesn't cure the underlying disease.
Exactly. The ultimate solution, according to Engels, isn't really about housing policy at all. You cannot solve the housing question within capitalism. To truly solve the housing crisis, society must abolish the capitalist mode of production entirely.
You have to go to the root.
You have to stop the systemic exploitation of labor that creates the massive wealth disparity in the first place. You have to eliminate the need for a reserve army of desperate labor.
And he goes even further than just abolishing capitalism. He targets the very concept of the city itself. He argues that the extreme concentration of humans in massive, unhealthy, polluted megacities must be actively dismantled. He calls for abolishing the antithesis between town and country.
A huge, huge concept.
What does that actually look like in practice, abolishing the antithesis of town and country?
Okay.
Because that sounds huge.
It is huge. It implies a radical, complete restructuring of human geography and society on a planetary scale. It means integrating industrial production and agriculture evenly across the landscape, rather than having these massive, hyperdense, polluted urban centers that act like black holes, sucking the life, the resources, and the labor out of the surrounding rural areas.
So spreading things out.
It's about distributing the human population more evenly and harmonizing industrial production with the natural environment and agricultural needs. Engels believed that as long as you have the modern big city, this massive centralized engine of capitalist accumulation, you will always inevitably have a housing crisis.
They are permanently linked.
To want to solve the housing question while maintaining the modern big city is, in his words, an absurdity.
Wow. Okay. We have covered a tremendous, exhausting amount of ground today. We have traversed a lot of history and a lot of very dense economic theory. Let's do a quick, high-level summary of the deep dive to tie all these threads together.
That sounds like a good idea.
We started by looking at the sheer physical horrors of industrial urbanization in the 19th century. The windowless cellars, the raw sewage in the streets, the active weaponization of evictions to break strikes. We examined how cities like Manchester were geographically, intentionally engineered to hide the working poor behind elegant commercial facades.
And how Haussmannization in Paris was just a military strategy that sweeps the slums into different neighborhoods like squeezing a water balloon.
From there, we dismantled the failed utopian dreams. We looked at the bourgeois trap of the company town that chains the worker to the factory floor, making resistance impossible.
Right.
We examined the Proudhonist delusion that you can magically declare rent to be a mortgage, completely ignoring ground rent and the mobility required by modern industry. And we dug into Engels' brilliant counterintuitive application of the iron law of wages, proving that under capitalism, mass homeownership can actually be used to depress wages by lowering the cost of reproducing labor.
And finally, we arrived at Engels' radical vision: the immediate emergency expropriation of luxury housing to shelter the homeless, leading ultimately to the total abolition of the capitalist mode of production and the physical dismantling of the industrial megacity itself.
It is a sweeping structural macroeconomic view of a problem that we, even today, often try to solve with very small, localized bandages.
It definitely forces you to zoom out.
And that leads me to exactly how I want to wrap this up. I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day. Today, in our modern world, we almost always view the housing crisis as a technocratic failure.
We do.
When rent goes up, we blame zoning laws, we blame supply chain issues with lumber, we blame high interest rates at the central bank, or lack of tax incentives for real estate developers. We treat the housing crisis like a broken machine that just needs the right tweak of a wrench to fix.
But if we take Engels' framework seriously, even if you just use it as a purely analytical tool, we have to ask ourselves a much more uncomfortable, fundamental question.
What's that?
Is our current housing crisis actually a system failure? Or is the system working exactly, perfectly as it was designed to? Is it successfully extracting maximum wealth for a few while maintaining a desperate, compliant, and highly competitive workforce?
Think about that the next time you see a gleaming glass luxury high-rise being built right next to a struggling working-class neighborhood where people are being priced out. Think about whether the blueprints of our modern society are actually designed for human shelter, or if they are still, 150 years later, just designed for extraction.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the historical origins of the housing question.
We'll see you next time.